My father, Robert, a retired police captain who was used to being the authority in any room, just sat there in the sterile, soundproofed briefing room. His face, usually a mask of stern, unshakable confidence, was a study in utter, slack-jawed disbelief. His world was tilting on its axis, and he couldn't find his balance. Across the polished mahogany table, the deputy director of the CIA didn't even look at him. He was irrelevant. The director's gaze was fixed entirely on me. "Dr. Anya Sharma," he said, his voice cutting through the heavy silence. "You have the floor. The asset is yours. The recovery operation is yours to design. Tell us what you need." Just 3 days earlier, I was in a completely different universe, my parents' house for our weekly Sunday dinner. The air was thick with the familiar smell of my mother's roast chicken and the sound of my brother, Ben, the golden boy police detective my father simply adored, telling an animated story about a recent case. As he spoke, the mail arrived. Tucked between the bills and junk flyers was a strange, flimsy envelope addressed to me. There was no return address, only a peculiar, spidery script that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. A script I never, ever thought I would see again. I turned it over in my hands, a cold knot tightening deep in my stomach. The handwriting was a jolt from a past I had walled off and buried. My father noticed my sudden silence and let out a familiar, condescending scoff. "Another pen pal, Anya? I thought you gave that up in middle school." He shot a knowing wink at Ben, who just gave a non-committal shrug, refusing to take a side. "Honestly, with your little government policy job, I'm surprised you have time for anything but alphabetizing files." It was the same dismissive tone he used when I got my doctorate. The same one he used when I tried to explain my research, as if it were all a charming but ultimately useless hobby. My mother, a woman who valued a quiet dinner over any kind of confrontation, quickly added, "Maybe it's from that think tank of yours, dear. They probably want you to write another paper nobody will ever read." I said nothing. I just carefully placed the letter in my bag, my outward expression calm while a storm raged inside me. It wasn't from a pen pal. It belonged to a ghost. The next morning at my office in Langley, I didn't open it. My hands were perfectly steady as I slipped the envelope into a sterile evidence bag, the plastic crinkling in the dead quiet of the secure room. I walked it down the long, anonymous hallway to my superior, Director Evans. Without a word, I placed it on his desk. "Sir," I said, my voice perfectly level, "we have a possible Phoenix communication." He picked it up, and his entire demeanor shifted in an instant. The collegial warmth vanishing, replaced by a razor-sharp intensity that could cut glass. He studied the handwriting for a long moment, and I saw the blood drain from his face. His eyes shot up to mine, wide with alarm. "Get counter-intel," he ordered, his voice a low, urgent command that tolerated no delay. "Now, report this to the 7th floor. Seal this office." My father thought it was junk mail from a lonely academic. He had no idea he'd just mocked the handwriting of a man the entire intelligence community had presumed dead for 5 years. To understand why that single envelope triggered a level 1 security alert, you have to understand the 2 lives I was living. For my family, I existed as a carefully constructed narrative, a story they wrote for me and were comfortable with. Anya, the quiet academic, the bookworm who traded a life of action for a safe, sterile government office, pushing papers and writing reports that nobody read. It was a simple 2-dimensional character, and for years I played the part because it was easier than explaining the truth. The truth was complicated. The truth belonged to a different world entirely, a world that operated in the shadows, where the stakes weren't promotions or local accolades, but the delicate balance of global security. I remember my brother Ben's police academy graduation like it was yesterday. The sun was bright, reflecting off the polished badges and crisp blue uniforms. My father, Robert, stood at the podium, his voice booming with a pride so immense it seemed to shake the very air. He spoke of legacy, of a commitment to real public service. He talked about walking the beat and seeing the world for what it is, a place that needs a firm hand. When he called Ben to the stage, the applause was deafening. He pinned the badge on my brother's chest, a perfect tableau of a legacy fulfilled. I saw my father's dream made real. Then, his eyes scanned the crowd and found me. "And I have to thank my daughter, Anya," he said, his voice softening into a different key, the one reserved for pleasant afterthoughts. She got her PhD, she works for the government, analyzing foreign policy. We're all very proud. The applause was polite, scattered, a fraction of what it was for Ben. In that moment, I wasn't just seeing the ceremony, I was seeing my own doctoral defense, a grueling 4-hour intellectual battle against 3 of the sharpest minds in international relations. My celebration had been a quiet dinner, where my father patted my hand and asked if I could finally get a real job now. I just smiled at the graduation, a ghost in my own family's story. Now contrast that with a memory from 5 years ago. I'm not in a sunny field, I'm in a secure, undisclosed location deep in the forests of Germany. The room is gray, soundproofed, and smells of stale coffee and fear. Across from me sits one of Russia's most senior intelligence chiefs, a man codenamed Nightingale, who has just defected with a head full of secrets that could cripple his country's foreign intelligence operations. He is brilliant, paranoid, and profoundly dangerous, a human black box who trusts no one. My job, my real job, is to be the only person in the world he can trust. I'm not analyzing policy. I am engaged in a high-stakes psychological chess match, patiently dismantling the walls of a master spy's mind, piece by agonizing piece. For 6 months, I spend 12 hours a day with him. I learn about the daughter he left behind, the brand of cigarettes he chain-smoked, the poetry he loved as a young man. I build a rapport not with threats or force, but with empathy and relentless patience. It was in one of those quiet moments, over a game of chess, that we created a fail-safe. A specific, non-verbal duress code. A phrase about a songbird embedded in his unique, spidery handwriting that he could use if he was ever compromised. It was a lifeline that only I would recognize. My work wasn't abstract. It was terrifyingly real. One day, General Markson, the European theater commander, observed one of our sessions from behind a one-way mirror. He was a man of few words, a hardened soldier who had seen it all. Afterwards, he pulled my boss aside, and I later learned what he'd said. "That woman," he'd grunted, gesturing toward me. "She has more steel than a tank battalion." It was the kind of validation I had always craved, a recognition of the strength I had to keep hidden. It was a praise my own father, with his obsession with visible strength, would never be able to comprehend. He saw a badge and a gun as proof of courage, but the battles I fought were silent, waged in quiet rooms with the fate of nations on the line. The two worlds were kept separate by a system of enablers. My mother, a woman who treated any ripple of discord like a tidal wave, would often say to me in the quiet of the kitchen, "You know how your father is, Anya. He just understands things he can see. Guns, badges. Your work is so abstract." What she was really saying was, don't rock the boat, don't challenge the narrative. Let your father have his world the way he likes it. Her words were meant to soothe, but they always felt like a plea for me. To remain small, to stay in the neat little box they had built for me. And my brother Ben, he wasn't malicious, but he was a product of that world. He'd put a comforting arm around me after one of Dad's dismissive comments and say, "Dad's just old school and he doesn't get the whole PhD thing. He's proud, he just doesn't know how to say it." He was always trying to be the bridge between us, but he was standing firmly on my father's side of the chasm. He saw my hurt, but he saw it as my problem to manage, not our father's problem to fix. To him, Dad's worldview was the sun, and we all simply revolved around it. He couldn't see that I wasn't in orbit at all. I was in a different galaxy. For my entire life, my father judged my worth by a metric I could never meet. He respected the uniform Ben wore, but couldn't see the invisible armor I wore every single day. That was about to change. The letter from my ghost wasn't just a message, it was a summons. And it was going to force my two worlds to collide in a room with no exits. The lab results came back, and they were conclusive. The ink, the paper, the almost microscopic indentation of the pen, it was all authenticated. The letter was from Nightingale, and the embedded duress code confirmed he was in imminent danger. In that instant, listening to the sterile report from the forensics tech, something inside me shifted and went cold. For years I had quietly absorbed the narrative my family had written for me, hoping they would see my worth through some emotional breakthrough. But emotion was their language, a language of grand gestures and loud proclamations. My world, the one I truly lived in, ran on protocol, procedure, and cold hard fact. A Phoenix communication triggered an automatic asset integrity protocol, a full inquiry where I, as the primary handler, had a central, undeniable role. I wasn't going to have a tearful confrontation, I was going to seek operational control. It wasn't revenge. It was a correction. The system itself, the very rulebook I had dedicated my life to, handed me the perfect tool. The letter had been delivered to my parents' home, an address tied to a shallow cover identity I hadn't used in nearly a decade. This single fact, this tiny procedural detail, made my father, as the head of the household, a mandatory person of interest in the chain of custody. It wasn't personal, it was a technicality, a necessary, unavoidable step. With a steady hand that betrayed none of my inner resolve, I filled out the official digital request form. Under the section for mandatory witnesses for the initial threat assessment, I typed his name, Robert Sharma, retired police captain. I hit submit, knowing exactly how he would see it, not as a summons, but as a desperate plea for help from his daughter, who was finally in way over her head. He would walk in expecting to be the expert. I walked the request to Director Evans myself. He read the form on his monitor, his expression unreadable, then leaned back in his chair and looked up at me. He confirmed the protocol without hesitation. The original case file for Operation Nightingale will be unsealed for this briefing, he said quietly, his voice low. Only those with direct need to know will be present. Your father's presence is unorthodox, but since the breach physically involves his residence, it's justifiable. He paused then, letting the weight of the moment settle in the room, his gaze searching mine. Are you sure you want to do this, Anya? All the years of being dismissed, of being patted on the head and called a paper pusher, they solidified into a single, unshakable resolve. I met his eyes without flinching. The asset's life depends on us following procedure, I replied, my voice even. And procedure states the primary handler leads the assessment. He simply nodded, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. He knew everything I wasn't saying. The official summons was sent to my father's house. He called me that night, his voice thick with the kind of patronizing concern I knew so well. Don't you worry, Anya. I'll be there. I'll help you sort out this mess with your federal bosses. He had no idea he wasn't coming to save me. He was coming to my world, by my official request, to be a witness to the truth. The day of the briefing, I watched my father arrive on a security monitor. He walked through the halls of Langley with a misplaced swagger, a man used to projecting authority in precinct houses and courtrooms. He was wearing his old suit, the one he saved for important occasions, but here, surrounded by the quiet, anonymous efficiency of the agency, he just looked out of place, uncomfortable. He was escorted into the sensitive compartmented information facility, the SCIF, and I saw a flicker of unease in his eyes. There are no windows in a SCIF. The walls are soundproof, the air is still, and the silence is absolute. It is a place completely removed from the world, and it was my world. He was expecting a small office meeting, a chance to sit down and help his daughter sort out some bureaucratic mess. Instead, he found himself in a tiered briefing room, facing a polished mahogany table. Director Evans was there, along with a 2-star Air Force general and the agency's head of counterintelligence. The air was thick with a gravity my father had never experienced. He tried to reclaim his footing, to impose his familiar authority on the room. He walked toward the table, extending a hand. Director, he began, his old police captain voice attempting to take charge. I'm Robert Sharma. I understand my daughter's gotten herself into a bit of a... Director Evans didn't even stand. He cut him off with a crisp, indifferent gesture toward an empty chair. Have a seat, Mr. Sharma. You are here as a witness. The dismissal was so swift, so total, that my father was left speechless. He sat down, his confidence visibly deflating. The lights in the room dimmed, and a single grainy photograph of a man's face appeared on the main screen. It was Nightingale. My father stared at it, confused. The Air Force general began to speak, his voice a low, serious monotone. 5 years ago, he said, we exfiltrated one of the most valuable assets of the post-Cold War era. The operation was codenamed Nightingale. My father leaned forward, his cop instincts kicking in. This was language he understood. The general continued, outlining the stakes in stark, powerful terms. The intelligence he provided saved hundreds of lives and allowed us to neuter 3 hostile foreign networks completely. His value to the national security of this country is and was immeasurable. He paused, letting the weight of his words fill the silent room. I watched my father's face. He was hooked, trying to figure out his part in all of this. He was a man who saw the world in black and white, good guys and bad guys. He was now being shown a universe of shadows he never knew existed. Director Evans took over, his tone even more serious. Nightingale's handler, the officer who developed him as an asset, recruited him and was his sole point of contact for the entire 6-month debriefing, was one of the best we've ever had. I saw my father nod slightly, a sign of respect for this anonymous legendary officer. We believed the asset was compromised and killed 2 years after resettlement, the director continued. This letter proves otherwise. He gestured to a young technician, who walked to the table carrying a thick, red-bordered binder. It made a soft, heavy sound as he placed it in front of the director. Mr. Sharma, Director Evans said, his eyes locking onto my father's. As the letter arrived at your residence, it is a matter of protocol that you understand the full scope of this situation. We need you to see who you'll be dealing with. With a slow, deliberate movement, the director opened the file and turned it so my father could see the cover page. Time seemed to slow down. I watched my father's eyes scan the page. I saw the moment of initial confusion, his brow furrowing as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. Then, his eyes widened. His gaze darted from the official photograph clipped to the page to me, sitting silently at the head of the table. And then, back to the page. His face drained of all color. All the air seemed to leave his body at once. There, in bold block letters, was the undeniable truth. Primary Case Officer, Dr. Anya Sharma. My signature was on every authorization line. My name, the name he associated with dusty books and pointless policy papers, was listed next, to operational terms like covert action, psychological profiling, and asset handling. He was staring at 30 years of his own dismissiveness being dismantled by a single piece of paper. He was speechless. Director Evans closed the file, the sound echoing in the profound silence. He then turned his chair slightly, looking not at my father, but to me. Anya, he said, his voice a calm transfer of power. The floor is yours. I stood up, my movement fluid and confident. The entire room, the general, the director, the head of counterintel, all of them turned their full attention to me. My father was just a spectator now, a witness to a reality he had refused to see. The duress code in the letter is, "The thrush sings at dusk," I began, my voice clear and steady. It means his safe house is compromised and his contingency plan has failed. He's asking for emergency extraction. Here is my plan. For 30 years, he had lectured me on the difference between theory and practice. In the end, it only took one signature on one classified file for him to understand that my theory had saved more lives than his entire precinct. As my briefing on the extraction plan concluded, the room, which had been so silent, erupted in a low hum of activity. But the energy in the space had completely reoriented itself. The general, the director, the head of counterintel, they didn't move toward the door. They moved toward me. They huddled around my position at the head of the table, firing off questions about logistics, risk assessment, and rules of engagement. I answered each one, my mind already deep in the complexities of the mission. In that moment, my father ceased to exist to them. He was just a civilian in a chair, a piece of furniture in a room where giants were planning to move mountains. He sat frozen, watching this world that had been invisible to him suddenly coalesce around his daughter with an intensity he couldn't comprehend. He was a ghost here. As we began to file out of the skiff, he tried to catch my eye. I saw him out of my periphery, his face a mixture of shock, shame, and a desperate, pleading confusion. He opened his mouth to say something. My name, perhaps. But I was already in a deep, hushed discussion with the tactical team lead, pointing to a detail on a satellite map on a tablet. I didn't ignore him out of spite. I ignored him because my focus, my entire being, was already thousands of miles away, with the man whose life depended on my competence. My father stood there for a moment longer, then turned and left the building alone. 6 weeks later, I was in a different kind of windowless room. This one was a temporary command post at a forward operating base in a neutral country, and it smelled of ozone and sweat. The only light came from the glow of a dozen monitors, and on the main screen, a live drone feed showed a grainy thermal image of a dark street. My street. My plan was in motion, unfolding in real time halfway across the world. Director Evans was on the sat phone, his voice a calm presence in my ear, but he wasn't giving orders. He was receiving my updates. Echo 1, what's the status of the package? He'd ask. Package is secure. Moving to the extraction point, I'd reply. It was my operation, my team, my call. My team, my new family, surrounded me. They were a mix of grizzled special operators who had forgotten more about combat than my father ever knew, and sharp young analysts who could pull a needle of data from a haystack the size of a continent. They didn't know I had a PhD. They didn't know my father was a retired police captain, or that my brother was a detective. They knew me only as Echo 1, the call sign for the mission commander. They knew I was the one who had architected the plan to bring a ghost home. Their respect wasn't given out of obligation or social nicety. It was quiet, absolute, and earned in the crucible of a life-or-death operation. Here, my worth was never a topic for discussion. It was simply a fact. Weeks after I returned to Langley, after the debriefings were complete and Nightingale was secure, my phone buzzed on my desk. It was a text from my brother Ben. Dad told me all of it. I don't even know what to say, Anne. He wants to talk. A moment later, a second text came through, from a number I knew but rarely saw on my screen. It was my father. The message was short, stripped of all his usual bluster. It just said, Anya. I was wrong. Can we talk? I stared at those words for a long time, the words I had once desperately longed to hear. I waited for a surge of triumph, of anger, of anything. But I felt nothing. There was no satisfaction, no vindication. There was only distance. It was the quiet, calm finality of a chapter that had already ended. The emotional ledger I had kept for so long had been balanced and closed, not by his admission, but by my own success. His apology was a key to a door I had already walked through and locked from the other side. I put the phone down, the screen still glowing with his message. My eyes fell to a new file on my desk, its red classified stamp a familiar invitation, an invitation to my real life. I picked it up and began to read. My father spent his life collecting trophies he could display on a mantelpiece. I learned that the greatest honors are the ones that must remain invisible. If you've ever had to build your own legacy in the shadows, tell us your story in the comments. In this community, we see the work that gets done in silence.